Thinking outside the binary and intersectionality, social movements based on a single identity politics have historically conflated or ignored differences, and this has sometimes resulted in growing tensions between the social movements themselves. It is easy to dismiss eugenics as a relic of a bygone era, but the continued association of race and disability in debilitating ways necessitates that we examine how eugenic practices to continue to reconstitute social hierarchies in contemporary context via the deployment of hegemonic ideology of disability have real material effects on people located at the intersection of difference. Spirit Murder and the New Eugenics. Critical Race Theory Meets Disability Studies. The three stories of Eleanor Bumpurs, Junius Wilson, and Cassie and Aaliyah Smith, however they may appear to be, are not unique. Police brutality, false imprisonment, and educational negligence are commonplace in the lives of people of color, especially those who are located at the margins of the multiple identity categories. So common are these practices that CRF scholar Patricia Williams has argued that these kinds of assaults should not be dismissed as the odd mistake but rather be given a name that associates them with criminality. Her term for such assaults on the individual's personhood is spirit murder, and which she describes as the equivalent of body murder. Inclusive education in the interlocking of ability and race in the United States. One important consequence of using these research approaches is that school-based responses to this problem have focused on psychology rather than systemic solutions that offer the possibility of understanding the psychological, political, and cultural contexts undergird disproportionality. For instance, if neighborhoods are organized along the boundaries that define immigrant nationalities, how do these monocultural enclaves impact the ways that teachers and students alike identify intellectual and cultural capital in the classroom? A cultural historical examination of parent-school relationships will benefit from an analysis of families' interorganizational ties in places like churches in child care centers. These organizations serve as a resource brokers to desirable social capital through their ties with state agencies, businesses, and other organizations. What resources are available in these ties that might otherwise be ignored by or invisible to school professionals? Are there aspects of civic engagement that could be capitalized on in school-family relationships? Reflective questions. What is your earliest experience dealing with race and/or racism? How did you feel while this was happening or watching? What was your response, and what was the response of others around you? What impact did it have on you? What did you learn from the experience? Did the encounter change you in some way, and if so, how? If you would like your students to present these stories publicly after writing them, you might use one of these methods. Record the stories on video, create an illustration of the encounter, create comic or storyboards that tell the story, illustrate the story with 5 or more selfies that convey your thoughts and feelings, create a Snapchat story that illustrates what happened, perform part of the story with spoken word, song, or performance art. The intracategorical framework is especially promising to CRF, critical race feminist, scholars because it validates the reality of racism as it intersects with sexism and other social categories of difference, e.g. heterosexism, classism, in the everyday lives of women of color. However, Yuval Davis, while producing a list of possible differences, potentially incomplete, that includes race/skin color, ethnicity, nation/state, class, culture, ability, age, sedentariness/origin, wealth, north-south, religion, stage of social development, ask if it is even conceivable to address. If the intracategorical framework rejects merely tacking on difference to its litany of categories, e.g. disability, it would have to, in effect, reject the additive approach to multiple difference, instead of utilize what Yuval Davis has described as the constitutive approach to multiple differences. This approach, while foregrounding the actual experiences of women of color at the intersection of multiple social categories, also describes structural conditions within which these social categories are constructed by, and intermeshed with each other in historical contexts. The association of race with disability has been extremely detrimental. People of color in the U.S. not just in education but also a store called where associations of race and disability have been used to justify the brutality of slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism. Unfortunately, rather than nurturing an alliance between race and disability. CRT scholars, like other radical scholars, have mistakenly conceived of disability as a biological category, as an immutable and pathological abnormality rooted in the medical language of symptoms and diagnostic categories. Disability studies scholars, on the other hand, have critiqued this deficit model of disability and have described disability as a socially constructed category that derives meaning and social, significance from the historical, cultural, political, and economic structures that frame social life. Finally, perhaps most telling is how disability as a social not a clinical condition was used to establish the benevolence of the special education of bureaucracy, and in doing so masked the violence that became an inextricable part of Cassie's educational career. Cassie was first MR, then ADHD, and then LD labels that ebbed and flowed with the passing tides in different contexts. Clearly, given its temporality, mental retardation cannot be a robust category. So, could it be that the educational gatekeepers, when confronted with an allegedly undisciplined, economically disadvantaged, African American girl, fearfully sought the protection of the label mental retardation, a label that would justify her incarceration at the tender age of 5 years old and continue to support her social isolation as it made its punitive march on the successive legs of her young educational career? Inclusive education. Despite growing consensus around definitions of inclusive education, there are few similarities from context to context. For instance, beginning in 1968, special education critics in the United States pointed to the flaws in an educational process that seemed to promise specialized treatment and interventions linked to specific needs for students who are identified in specific disability categories. Beginning in 1995, call for inclusive education in the United States found voice in the research literature. The work of Soja and others helps to understand how spatial relationships such as proximity, physical, intellectual, and social resources, other people, and multiple languages inform, influence, and complete individual and collective narratives about what is valued, useful, and desirable. Woven into the spatial narratives are historical, contemporary, and future-oriented notions of time and people's agency. We consider disability an ideal type of boundary object. An ideal type does not accurately describe the details of any locality or thing. It is an abstracted from all the names, and may be fairly vague, e.g. species. Thus, an ideal type of boundary object is adaptable to specific sites because of its vagueness. These objects delete local contingencies. We are also interested in standardized boundary objects that are used as methods of common communication across dispersed work groups. These objects delete local uncertainties. We consider relative risk ratios a standardized boundary object. How do factors like teacher salary and attrition across districts, history of desegregation, court orders, teacher perceptions of student ability, and a teacher and parent perceptions of neighborhood violence and trust that can mediate parent-teacher-teacher-student interactions shape disability identification decisions? Interestingly, research suggests that all of these factors are linked to equity concerns in education, some of which also bear on the disproportionate representation problem. Reframing this problem from the standpoint of disability as boundary object opens opportunities to examine aspects and issues that otherwise would be ignored in the traditional research paradigm. Although Asian American students at Mendoza K-8 school were overrepresented, and African American white students approached disproportionality levels, student sense of support as measured by the survey was high. It is also important to raise questions about what happens to students who constitute a small portion of the student population in schools where there is a strong social cohesion among the majority population. How does this situation shape their chance to be placed in special education? What would be the impact of strengthening collective self-efficacy in the community for school practices? In contrast, African American learners at Madrigal School were 3 times as likely to be identified with disabilities. Given that the school's students reported the lowest sense support rates, it is relevant to question how a rather negative mood among students is associated with a heightened level of disproportionality for African Americans. Although we do not have evidence on the local civic engagement, we present a GI's image of transnational civic engagement that is distinctive of neighborhoods where first-generation immigrants live. The proposed framework affords the examination of evidence that is not typically used in equity research on the racialization of disability and hence the project of inclusive education. By superimposing a variety of data sets that canvass the same geographic area but address different aspects of the cultural, economic, political, and linguistic environmental context, researchers can inform a more complex understanding of how educational inequities, e.g., disproportionate representation of racial minority learners in disability categories, are, or are not, mediated by community contacts that have been theorized but not substantiated as playing a role in influencing inequity. In some instances, these analyses can offer counter-narratives to long-standing assumptions that endorse deficit of these communities and hence, of their educational worthiness. Importantly, layering data punctuates the importance of understanding the ways in which seemingly bounded agendas, like inclusive education, are inexplicably linked to multiple social phenomena not only in their genesis, e.g., let's fix deficit thinking, but also in their historical links to other forms of segregation that are not typically associated. Further, by examining patterns within inequities, intersections are uncovered that make transparent to scholars, practitioners, community members, families, and students. Here are a few more advanced topics we will examine that identify the bias, and discuss examples of each concept, an opportunity for our self-advocates to explore this in their personal biography. The terms through which we'll do this are binary and intersectionality, slippage assumption and media, overdeterminism and institutionalization, self-determination and advocacy, attacking the spirit, power, and desire, social capital, speaking up, free speech and guidelines for guest speakers, screen theory and quantitative inclusion, qualitative inclusion and education, microaggression, safe spaces and trigger warnings, inherent bias, biased code, and policy reform. We with use case studies often to applying something that relates to the concept as it interacts with diversity.